I want to taste your lips. Steam curled thick in the dim bathhouse, a haze of heat clinging to every timber wall. Garrett Boone, blonde-haired, once bred to silk and silver, sat bare-backed before the wooden tub, his muscles taut beneath sun-bronzed skin. Behind him, Aurelia Hayes, skin dark as river earth, hardened by years of labor, pressed a warm cloth along his spine, her hand trembling with every pass. Their breaths tangled, ragged in the rising mist, until Garrett seized her wrist and turned her toward him. Blue eyes burned through the vapor, and his mouth crashed down on hers, fierce and hungry. Water dripped steady from the rafters. But the chains of a forced marriage shattered in that moment, leaving nothing but two souls, stripped of pretense, choosing each other at last. Summer of 1886, the chapel in Willow Bend burned with heat. The sun poured fire on the shingles, the timbers cracked, and the air pressed down heavy as a furnace. Dusty glass windows threw sharp shafts of light across the wooden pews where townsfolk crowded, fanning themselves with straw hats, sweat soaking through dark cloth. Not a soul left. Everyone wanted to see the wedding Willow Bend had whispered about for weeks. The forced union of Garrett Boone and Aurelia Hayes. The preacher stood before the altar, hands shaking around the Bible, voice droning steady like wagon wheels grinding on a dirt road. He spoke of love, sacrifice, holy union, yet in the stifling heat, with the bride and groom staring cold at one another, the words rang hollow. Garrett Boone stood tall, broad shoulders, blonde hair plastered with sweat, eyes drifting elsewhere. His white shirt hung open at the collar, hat loose in hand, his whole stance declaring he did not want to be there. Raised under his mother's indulgence, Garrett had never washed a shirt, nor shined a boot. Even on his own wedding day, he wore that careless air, as if playing a part written long ago. Beside him, Aurelia Hayes was all tension. Her dark skin caught the sunlight, white gloves clamped at her wrists like chains. Her face, weathered by years under Jacob Hayes's stern rule, held steady, chin high, eyes black and calm. Inside her chest, though, a silent cry pressed against the dam of discipline. A lifetime of lessons echoed. No tears, no trembling, no weakness shown. The vows came. Garrett recited each word smooth and flat, like a boy repeating lines. Aurelia, too, her voice steady, clipped, signing her name to a contract. There was no love in the air, only the weight of shackles. At the words, "You may kiss the bride," Garrett bent, brushed her lips, and drew back fast, as though from hot iron. Aurelia did not flinch, nor return it. A kiss so thin that a blink could erase it. Whispers rose in the pews. Martha the seamstress shook her head. The bride was too cold. Hank the saloon keeper chuckled low, turning awkwardness into a joke. Poor Garrett must have been pushed. The crowd muttered, pitied, knowing this was no marriage of hearts, only a bargain between families. Aurelia's father sat in the front row, eyes sharp as a blade. Garrett's mother dabbed her tears, smiling soft, while her son tugged at his collar and looked away. 37 minutes, the ceremony ended. To the pair before the altar, it felt like 37 years. The church bell tolled, echoing over town, a sound meant for joy, yet heavy as a funeral chime. Garrett reached his hand. Aurelia laid her gloved one in his, fingers loose, no grip. They walked down the steps together, side by side like prisoners bound for judgment. The crowd clapped, tossed hats, going through the motions. A hot gust swept dust onto Aurelia's hem. She lifted her face, eyes burning from the sun's glare, but found no hope there. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve. Did they love each other? The mother smiled thin, lied gentle. Of course, darling. A falsehood painted across the whole town's face. Garrett glanced sideways at his bride. For one breath, their eyes locked. His blue, empty. Her black, unyielding. No warmth, no turning away. Just the bare fact of seeing one another at last. On the chapel steps, beneath blazing sun and red dust, Garrett Boone and Aurelia Hayes became man and wife. Yet within them both, this was no beginning of love. It was a sentence. 2 years of silence, chill, and a wooden house waiting at the edge of Willow Bend. The town would gossip, pity, mock. But what no one knew, even in a prison built of vows and walls of wood, cracks could spread. And sometimes, from the coldest stone, love dares to grow. Garrett Boone had never known the scent of damp earth at dawn, or the cling of sweat on his back, when the sun first broke the horizon. From the hour he was born, life had been smoothed for him, every rough edge sanded away. Each morning, warm water was carried into his room, his clothes pressed and folded on the chair, while his mother poured milk with her own hand and left buttered bread on a tray. If the shirt he'd tossed careless on a chair the day before bore a speck of dust, by morning it was gone and returned spotless. His boyhood drifted soft and easy, like a stream without rocks. He could ride, though he rarely saddled his own horse. He could shoot, though never had he brought down game. When trouble loomed, hired cowboys were quick to handle it. Slowly, Garrett learned the most dangerous habit of all that the world bent to him, that life itself would always part like tall grass before his boots. If Garrett had been swaddled in ease, Aurelia Hayes was hammered in fire. Her father, Jacob Hayes, a wealthy trader known across 3 counties for his iron will, believed everything carried a price, including kindness. From her first memory, Aurelia knew she was no daughter to him, but a commodity, to be polished, hardened, and one day exchanged. At 6, when she spilled ink across his ledgers, he set her on her knees in a dark corner till dusk. No water, no comfort. The first time she wept, he told her, "If you cannot master your tears, you cannot master your fate." From then on, Aurelia swallowed every sob, taught her face to become a mask. Her days were cut into lessons. Morning, letters and sums. Noon, how to stand, how to greet, how to smile just enough to hide weakness, never enough to invite insult. Afternoon, trailing her father through the shop, watching, recording, learning the grind of bargains. Night, bent over a desk, copying lines until her hand cramped stiff. No stories, no lullabies, no room for dreams. In the Boone house, Garrett grew within laughter, family suppers, and the soft gaze of a mother who shielded him from duty. In the Hayes house, Aurelia grew within columns of numbers, contracts inked, and a father's stare that demanded flawlessness. So when the 2 families struck their quiet bargain, trading one name for another, 2 lives knotted fast. One man who had never lifted against hardship. One woman forged into steel, denied even the thought of freedom. Garrett looked at Aurelia as if she were some riddle, the first he had ever been asked to solve. Aurelia looked at Garrett as if he were a spoiled child, tall in frame yet hollow of weight. Their divide was not in habit alone, but in the marrow of who they were. One wrapped in velvet, the other pressed into stone. And now, bound by vows neither believed, they were made to share a roof, called to call each other husband and wife. The wooden house Garrett's father built for the newlyweds stood apart at the edge of Willow Bend, looking out over a sweep of grassland that rolled unbroken to the horizon. The walls still breathed resin, the shingles not yet dulled by weather. A narrow porch stretched like an outstretched arm, though to Aurelia it looked no different from the gate of a prison. On the first day, she set her dark leather valise down on the pine floor. The hard thud rang out, sharp as a gavel striking judgment. Garrett followed, hat dangling in hand, shoulders slouched against the doorframe. He gave the place a lazy glance, whistled low, as though the house were a jest his father had staged. Aurelia's eyes swept the small parlor with its rough-hewn chairs, the tidy yet lifeless kitchen, the 2 doors at the end of the hall. She pointed to the smaller room, her voice quiet but final. "I'll take that one." Garrett only shrugged, half grin careless. "Suits me. I don't need much space." So it was done. No discussion, no agreement. They split the house like strangers, renting rooms under the same roof. Their first meal passed in silence. Aurelia ladled stew into bowls, slid one across to him, set her own aside. He ate hunched over, spoon clinking against the crockery, the sound cutting through the whistle of wind at the seams of the house. No thanks spoken, no eyes met. When they finished, Garrett washed dishes, Aurelia wiped the table, and both retreated to their separate quarters. The days fell into rhythm, as clockwork as a mill wheel. Aurelia rose early, stoked the fire, left meals waiting. Garrett rose late, ate without comment, rode out to the ranch. At dusk he returned, weary, ate what she had set aside. She cleaned, he fed the fire. Not a word more than was required. The only phrase that ever broke the hush was her steady murmur, "Supper's ready," and his answer, no more than a nod. Once, when she set a bowl before him, her fingers brushed his hand. The touch was no more than a draught of air, yet Aurelia pulled back as though burned, eyes falling cold to the table. Garrett's glance lingered a moment on her hand, then on her face. A faint curl touched his lip, mockery or something else. Even he could not say. The silence closed in again. At night, 2 lamps burned apart. Garrett lay back on his wide bed, staring at the ceiling while the wind drummed its rhythm against the walls. Aurelia curled on the narrow cot, fists tight on the blanket, holding back tears no one would see. A single wall stood between them, but the true distance was far wider. One night Garrett stumbled home late, reeking of whiskey. He caught her silhouette, framed in moonlight at the window, back rigid, hair loose in dark strands over her shoulders. Words rose to his lips, some jest to crack the ice, but his throat closed. Instead, he sighed, dropped his hat on the table, and shut himself in his room. She did not turn, did not answer. To the town, marriage was the start of love. But in that cabin on the rim of Willow Bend, it was a contract hung invisible on the wall, unsigned, unspoken, yet binding them both by the hour. And in the weight of that silence, each told themselves, 2 years, only 2 years. Yet deep within, neither could know if those years would pass as a sentence served or open to a turn neither dared imagine. Each morning in the cabin at the edge of Willow Bend passed so alike it was near impossible to tell one day from the next. Sunlight slipped through the cracks, dust motes drifted in the air, and the smell of corn porridge lingered in the kitchen. Aurelia rose early, folding blankets, wiping the table, setting dishes in perfect order, as though an unseen hand commanded the house. Garrett, by contrast, left muddy boots at the door, tossed his coat across a chair, dropped his hat on the floor. At first Aurelia cleared it all without a word. Soon, though, her silence frayed into sighs, then into clipped reproaches. Boots don't belong there. A wet coat must be hung, or the stench will spread. At least set your hat straight. Her voice was never raised, but firm, dry as a whip crack. Garrett only shrugged, muttered, "Sure, sure," and walked off. Yet something inside him tightened. Never before had anyone corrected him. His mother had always followed behind, clearing his mess without complaint. To her, Garrett was the boon heir, untouchable. Now the smallest act drew Aurelia's disapproval, and he could not bear it. One afternoon he came home, weary and streaked with sawdust. No sooner had he stepped into the kitchen than Aurelia's voice struck, cold as well water. "I told you, wet coats must be hung. Otherwise the smell will seep into everything." He dropped his coat on a chair, eyes flashing. She went on, steady, without looking at him. "And the boots. Always the boots. I cannot clean up after you forever." Something in Garrett split. He slammed his palm against the table, the crack of it rattling the cup beside him. "Enough!" The word came out rough, startling even to his own ears. Aurelia froze, body rigid, eyes wide for a breath before lowering her gaze, gathering scraps of cloth with silent hands. No tears, no protest, only a silence, heavy as wet wool. That night they ate in silence too. She set her spoon down without a sound. He forced down bites, each clink of metal against crockery sharp in the air. Her quiet cut deeper than her scolding ever had. When the dishes were done, she shut her door. And after that day, she stopped correcting him at all. His coat lay draped, his boots tracked mud, his hat lay crooked, and Aurelia said nothing. Garrett thought he'd feel free. Instead, unease settled over him. Each time he walked the hall and found her door closed tight, he felt as if he'd misplaced something vital, though he could not name what. Late one night, with the stove gone cold, Garrett lay awake staring at the black ceiling. The wind pressed against the walls. Insects sang beyond the cracks. Then he heard it soft, muffled, yet clear. A choked sob from the room beside his. He sat up at once, heart hammering. Crossing the hall, he laid a hand on her doorknob but did not turn it. His voice, for the first time, trembled. "Aurelia, I'm sorry. I should not have done that." Her sobs broke louder, unhidden now. The sound pierced him. He twisted the latch and stepped inside. Aurelia sat curled at the edge of her bed, shoulders shaking. She turned her face, hiding behind her hands. Garrett dropped to his knees before her, arms circling her tight. "I was wrong. I'm sorry. I'll never again." Her body quaked against him, tears slipping free. He lowered his brow to her hair, his rough palm rubbing her back in slow, clumsy circles. "I'll change, I swear it. Don't cry. Please." The words were broken, repeated, awkward, but real. For the first time, he revealed what lay buried, his fear of losing the one fragile thread binding them. Aurelia gave no answer, only wept until the sobs thinned, breath by breath. Garrett held on, hands steady, heart aching. For the first time since vows were spoken, they were no longer two ghosts drifting apart, but two souls pressed close in the dark. When at last she lifted her face, eyes swollen, he whispered once more, "I'm sorry. I won't force your silence again." She looked at him for the briefest moment, then turned away. Yet she did not push him off, and to Garrett, that small allowance was enough to tell him a hairline crack had opened in the wall of ice between them. After the night Aurelia wept and Garrett stumbled through an apology, something in the cabin's air shifted. Neither named it, yet the next morning the fire seemed to burn brighter as Aurelia stoked the stove. When Garrett stepped onto the porch, he found his coat neatly hung on its peg. He hesitated, then bent to scrape the mud from his boots, before setting them aside, a small act. But Aurelia saw it, and for the first time in weeks, her gaze softened. In the days that followed, Garrett noticed his wife in ways he never had, how she bit her lip in concentration as she stitched, how her calloused hands trembled when lifting a pot of water. Trifles, perhaps. Yet to him they became the moments he awaited. One afternoon he came through the yard and stopped short. Aurelia crouched on the porch, loose strands of hair brushing her sun-dark cheek. Before her lay a stray dog, ribs sharp, eyes clouded by hunger. She broke her bread in two, laid it gently before its nose, her voice low, unguarded. "Eat. Don't be afraid. I won't harm you." The creature crept forward, licked at the crust. Aurelia stroked its back, awkward but tender. Garrett stood frozen, chest tight. The woman he thought forged of iron held a hidden gentleness he had never glimpsed. He turned away before she noticed, but the sound of her voice lingered with him long after. From then, he began to meet her silence with small offerings. One morning, finding her book left open, he marked her page with a scrap of paper instead of brushing it aside. That evening, Aurelia found the careful fold and pressed her lips together in the faintest line. Not quite a smile, not quite not, but Garrett saw the flicker in her eyes. In return, Aurelia left a basin of warm water by the washroom each morning. Garrett never spoke of it, but every time he leaned over the rising steam, he felt the weight of her quiet care. One winter noon, wind clawing across the plain, Aurelia stirred a pot of soup, steam rolling rich with onions and meat. Garrett came in, stripped off his gloves, stepped close. His breath grazed her neck, and she shivered. "Smells good," he said with a rough smile. "I want to taste it." She hesitated, dipped a spoon, and held it up. He shook his head, blue eyes glinting. "Not from a spoon. From your lips." Color rushed to her cheeks. She spun back to the pot, spoon clattering faintly against the rim. "Don't be foolish," she muttered, voice unsteady. But Garrett turned her gently, firelight spilling across her face, lighting her flushed skin, her lips pressed tight as if bracing against herself. "I'm not jesting," he said low, voice husky. "I mean it." Before she could answer, his mouth touched hers. First a brush, then deeper, warmer. The spoon slipped from her hand, clinking on the boards. Her body slackened, eyes closed, surrendering to the smoke, the salt of broth, the sweetness of a kiss. Garrett's hand pressed firm at her waist, as though she might vanish. Aurelia did not pull away. Her heart raced, the iron chains of her father's teaching melting in the heat between them. When at last their lips parted, she stared at him wide-eyed, breath ragged. Garrett only smiled faintly, resting his brow to hers. "You see? That's the true taste." She turned aside, face blazing, but her hands never pushed him back. In that kitchen, warmth no longer came only from the fire, it pulsed between two hearts that had, for the first time, met each other. The following evening, the first breath of spring drifted soft across Willow Bend. A sliver of moon hung tilted in the sky, silver light slipping through the narrow window, painting a pale trail across the wooden floor. In the kitchen, the fire murmured low, shadows dancing on the walls. Aurelia cleared the table, wiped it down with practiced care, then carried a basin of warm water and set it outside the washroom door for Garrett. He returned from the ranch, shirt damp with sweat, sawdust clinging to his shoulders. Pulling off his gloves, he caught sight of her bent over the steaming tub, the mist curling around her. Garrett paused, eyes glinting in the firelight. "You know," he said, voice low, almost playful, "I've carried a habit since I was a boy." Aurelia straightened, wary. "And what habit is that?" Leaning back against the chair frame, Garrett's mouth curved. "I always liked someone to scrub my back while I bathed. My mother did it when I was small. Later, she paid someone else to take her place." Aurelia froze, heat rushing to her cheeks. But his gaze held hers, steady and bright. "Now I think my wife could do that for me." The room thickened with silence. Aurelia longed to turn away, to refuse outright. Yet his eyes locked on hers, earnest, unyielding, until words caught in her throat. At last she drew a breath, gave the smallest nod. The washroom swam with steam. Garrett sat before the wooden tub, shirt gone, his broad back bared. His skin was sun-browned, marked with faint scars of ranch work. Aurelia knelt behind, cloth trembling in her hand. She pressed it to his shoulder, dragged it slowly down the ridge of his spine. Garrett shut his eyes, a sigh breaking loose. "Just like I remember. Only different. Because now it's my wife." Aurelia bit her lip, said nothing. Her strokes careful, steady, though her heart hammered faster with each pass. His breathing deepened, rough and low, stirring her hand to shake all the more. Yet she did not stop. "You know," he murmured, voice rasping, "I've never felt so close to anyone." Her hand faltered, eyes flickering, but she carried on, cloth trailing lower, droplets spattered on the boards, mingling with the heat of the air. Suddenly Garrett reached back, his calloused fingers closing tight around her wrist. Aurelia stiffened, pulse racing. He turned his head, eyes blazing through the mist, filled with need and fear alike. "Aurelia," he whispered, hoarse as wind through timber, "I want you to bear my child." She went still. Her eyes widened, lashes damp, breath catching hard in her chest. For a moment, silence pressed between them. Then, voice breaking yet steady beneath, she answered, "If you truly mean that, Garrett, then I want it too." The moment cracked wide. Garrett pulled her close, his mouth finding hers. At first the kiss was hesitant, uncertain, but with each breath, the fire surged, fierce and consuming. Aurelia clung to his shoulders, half resisting, half yielding, as Garrett held her tight, his hand roaming her back with trembling reverence. Their breaths tangled, heavy and raw, laced with soap and sweat and the salt of longing. She turned away, ashamed, yet his lips sought hers again, deeper, surer. Her body softened, heat flooding her veins. Garrett shook like a boy. Yet he would not let go, clutching her as if she might dissolve into the steam. The drip of water, the gasp of breath, the thrum of hearts, all fused into a single rhythm, primal and true. No walls, no contract, no silence. Only a man and a woman choosing each other, flesh and soul, with the hunger to be one. When at last the storm eased, Aurelia collapsed against his shoulder, her face flushed, her body trembling. Her breath came shallow, her eyes half-lidded, still dazed. Garrett wrapped his arms around her, holding her as though cradling the whole world. He whispered against her ear, voice rough but tender. From now on, no more pretending. Aurelia closed her eyes, nodded faintly. Inside her chest, she felt it. The beat of 3 hearts joined as one, her own trembling breath, Garrett's pounding pulse, and the first stir of a future newly born. Outside, the night lay dark and endless. But within the small wooden room, truth had been sealed. No longer shadows under one roof. They belonged to each other now in shyness, in longing, in the wild joy of choosing. Dawn crept softly through the small window, silvering the pine walls still warm from the night. Aurelia stirred and at once knew she was no longer alone. Garrett lay close, his arm draped around her waist, his breath steady against her hair. The sensation halted her awkward, yet strangely peaceful. Her first instinct was to slip away, to retreat into her old armor of silence. But Garrett's hand tightened even in sleep, as though he feared she might vanish. Aurelia stilled, heart pounding, cheeks burning. A thought whispered through her. She had truly crossed into another shore. Garrett shifted, lids heavy, blue eyes opening, drowsy but clear. He smiled, not the careless grin of a spoiled son, but the quiet smile of a man who had found what mattered most. Morning, Aurelia. His voice was husky, warm. She turned her face, murmured almost under breath, morning. So simple. Yet for them it was a beginning. No more silence weighed down by clinking spoons. No more air thick with things unsaid. Just 2 words, but they carried an unspoken truth. They were truly husband and wife now. That morning's meal was unlike any before. Aurelia's hands trembled over the pot, thoughts of the night still burning her cheeks, so much so that the soup nearly spilled. Garrett sat watching her every movement, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. When she set the bowl before him, he did not eat at once, but looked straight into her eyes. Thank you. His voice was quiet, sincere. She froze. Never before had he said those words, though she had cooked 100 meals. That single phrase made her feel less like a shadow in this house, more like someone seen. They ate slowly. The kitchen air, once heavy, now broke with shy laughter, with sidelong glances. Garrett told small stories from the ranch of a calf's first steps, of nearly stumbling while splitting logs. Trifles. Yet Aurelia found herself smiling, discovering his voice more comforting than the wind through the cabin walls. Afterward, as she bent to clear the table, Garrett caught her hand. She startled, eyes lifting. He said nothing, only held on gently, eyes bright with pride. Come to town with me today. She hesitated. Since the wedding, they had never walked together before the town's eyes. She remembered too well the whispers, the pitying glances. But his hand was warm, his grip firm, and she no longer wished to hide. Yes. They walked the dusty road into Willow Bend, hand in hand. For the first time since vows were spoken, they stood side by side. Garrett's stride was tall, his face alight, as if to show the whole town he was proud of his wife. Aurelia kept her head bowed, cheeks warm, yet she did not let go of his hand. Word spread swift as prairie wind. At the dressmaker's, Martha gaped from her doorway. Children paused mid-game, marbles forgotten. In the saloon, cowboys fell silent. watching them pass. Lord above. They're holding hands. Never thought it real. The murmurs followed, but Aurelia no longer felt herself a traded bride. For once, she felt seen as a wife, chosen and claimed beneath the open sky. Garrett caught the stares, and instead of shrinking, he gripped her hand tighter, his eyes declaring plain, "This is my wife, my choice." At the general store, the gray-haired shopkeeper looked up, startled, then smiled wide. "You two, you look well matched." Aurelia's chest fluttered. She met Garrett's gaze, and in that glance they both broke into soft laughter, a sound that washed away the long months of silence. That evening, as the sun burned red over the hills, they sat on the porch steps, gazing at the fields gilded by light. Garrett laid his hand atop hers, his voice low, steady. "Aurelia, maybe it's time we stop living like strangers. If we've begun, then let's truly build a home." She held still, the wind tugging her dress, carrying the scent of grass and damp earth. Fear and longing churned inside her, but when she met his eyes, no longer distant but filled with resolve, she nodded. "Then we promise. Not just to endure 2 years, but to build a true home together." Garrett squeezed her hand, a slow smile breaking. In that moment, a vow was made, not written by fathers, not sealed by signatures, but spoken by 2 hearts. And on that small porch, under a blaze of gold, they knew, but a choice, but a choice, but a choice. The afternoon in Willow Bend turned a dull gray, heavy clouds gathering like a storm biding its time. Garrett had just finished splitting a pile of logs, sweat still clinging to his brow, when he heard the crunch of wagon wheels grinding the dirt road. He straightened, narrowed his eyes. It was a carriage he knew well, the kind only his father ever used. Garrett's chest tightened. Boone, the man who had set every wheel of this fate in motion, was coming back. The wagon rolled into the yard and stopped before the small cabin. The driver leapt down, opened the door, and out stepped Mr. Boone. His bearing had not changed. Back ramrod straight, eyes cold as cut glass, every step carrying the weight of a man seasoned by power. His boots shone without a speck of dust. Others always bore the dirt for him. Garrett stood frozen for a moment, then wiped sawdust from his palms and stepped forward. He nearly lifted a hand in greeting, but his father swept past with a mere glance, striding inside without pause. Aurelia heard the door swing open. She emerged from the kitchen and stopped cold at the sight of the tall figure, the man who had bound her into a loveless marriage. Her chest clenched, though her face held steady calm. Boone wasted no time. He set a leather case on the table, snapped it open, and laid out papers with the precision of a business deal. On top lay a handwritten list, crisp and sharp, with a thick envelope beside it. 6 months, he said flatly. 6 months, and still nothing. No child, no sign. Boone needs an heir, Garrett. The name cannot be left to the wind. Garrett stood rigid, jaw set. Aurelia's hand tightened against her skirt. Each word fell like a hammer, striking the fragile trust she had only begun to nurture. "I've prepared options," Boone went on, sliding the papers toward his son. "Here are names of worthier girls, from families of standing, young, strong, well-bred. If Aurelia cannot, then I will set it right." Boone cannot waste time. Silence thickened. Aurelia's breath came shallow, but she did not speak. She knew too well her father-in-law's ear was deaf to protest. She had borne pitying looks from the town long enough, but hearing this from his own lips carved deep. Garrett kept his head bowed, shoulders taut. Boone mistook the silence for surrender. "I told you from the start, Garrett. This is duty. A Boone man must produce an heir. If you cannot—" He cut himself short, eyes flicking to Aurelia, sharp as a blade. "Then another will." The words struck her like steel. She lowered her gaze, hand trembling on the table to mask her hurt. For a heartbeat, she believed Garrett would yield, as always, bend beneath the shadow of his father. But then came what none expected. Garrett lifted his head, eyes blazing with a fire never seen before. He rose, voice ringing firm. You don't need to find another. She is with child. The room froze. Aurelia's head jerked up, eyes wide with shock. Boone faltered, the papers still in his grip. What did you say? His voice cracked, shaken for the first time. Garrett's reply cut clean. Every word anchored. Aurelia is carrying my child. She will give Boone an heir. You need not interfere further. Aurelia felt the world spin. Never had she heard him speak so sure. Never seen him stand against the man who had ruled his life. Yet here he was, not only resisting, but claiming her as his own before that authority. Boone's stare bore into his son, searching for weakness. Then it shifted to Aurelia, probing her eyes for a crack in the facade. But after a moment's daze, Aurelia steadied. She raised her chin, black eyes bright with defiance, giving no denial. Is it true? Boone asked, voice low. Garrett did not blink. True. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the wind rattling the cabin's seams like a drumbeat. At last, Boone eased back. He gathered the papers slowly, each motion more deliberate than before. If that is so, I will wait. Boone requires a child, but if you have begun, I will hold my tongue. He closed the case, signaled the driver. At the door, he paused, eyes still cold, though the edge of his power had dulled. Do not fail me, Garrett. Boone does not forgive failure. The door slammed, wheels grinding as the carriage receded down the road. In the cabin, Aurelia stood motionless, her heart still trembling. She did not know whether to scold Garrett for his bold lie, or to be moved by his choosing her. Garrett turned, stepped close, clasped her hand. Forgive me, he murmured. It was the only way to stop him. Her eyes shone, though no tears fell. She whispered, voice laced with both reproach and warmth. Garrett, you've left me no way back. He bent and pressed his lips to her hand. Then let us move forward. Not for him, not for Boone, for us. And in that moment, Aurelia felt a shift beyond return. The man who once shirked every burden now stood tall, not only for himself, but for her. From that day on, their small wooden house ceased to be a cage. It became their bastion, a place where together they would stand against the shadow of the past that sought to claim them. Boone's carriage rolled out of Willow Bend, leaving a haze of red dust in its wake. Inside the cabin, the air held taut, stretched thin as wire. Aurelia stood rigid, hands clasped tight against her chest. Garrett's words still echoed sharp in her mind. She is with child. She turned to him, her dark eyes brimming with unease. Why would you say that before your father? If he finds out it isn't true. Garrett leaned against the doorframe, the firelight glinting in his blue eyes, his mouth curved in a smile that was both daring and gentle. Then let's make it true. The breath caught in her throat. Her heart raced too fast for any protest to form. Garrett moved toward her, step by steady step, until only a breath of space remained. The kiss came sudden, fierce, without warning. His arm wrapped her close, and Aurelia trembled, her fists clutching her skirt before loosening, rising to circle his neck in a frantic grasp. The fire cracked, smoke and sweat mingled, filling the air thick. Garrett lifted her, set her atop the wooden table, still scented with herbs and flour. She gasped, legs tightening around his waist to steady herself. She might have spoken refusal, but his mouth silenced her in burning insistence. We'll give him a real answer, Garrett whispered against her lips. She could not answer, save with the wild beat of her heart. In the days that followed, desire wove itself into every corner of the house. One evening Garrett came home from the ranch, shirt plastered with sweat, hair damp across his brow. Instead of holding back as before, Aurelia ran out onto the porch, arms circling him before he could lay down his saddle. She pressed her cheek against his chest, breathing in the hay-sweet scent of him. Garrett froze, then laughed soft and held her fast. They kissed there in the yard, in the dust and late sun, unashamed. Another time she was kneading dough, her hands dusted white. Garrett came in quiet, then wrapped his arms around her waist from behind. Flour smeared his shirt, streaking pale across the fabric. Aurelia laughed, half protest, but his lips found the curve of her neck, breath hot, and her laughter broke into shivers. She braced against the table, the dough forgotten. In the narrow washroom, Aurelia set a basin of hot water, only to turn and find him stepping inside. She flushed, tried to push him back, but Garrett's hand caught the nape of her neck, drawing her close into the steam. His touch slid down her spine. Her body, startled, melted into his, without resistance. One night he returned late, bone-tired, shoulders sagging. He had scarcely closed the door when Aurelia came to him, eyes alight in the glow of the oil lamp. Without a word, she pulled him down into a searing kiss. Garrett's hat tumbled to the floor as his arms crushed her tight. "Aurelia," he rasped between breaths. "I can't be apart from you anymore." She clung to him, voice shaking but clear. "Then don't. Stay. Always." He swept her into the bedroom. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting entwined shadows on the walls. This time they reached for each other without hesitation. His hands roamed with a clumsy reverence. Her own trembled, yet returned every touch. Each kiss, each caress carried the truth they had remade. They were no longer bound by compulsion. They were choosing, wholly, freely. When the storm of their passion quieted, Aurelia lay against his chest, her ear resting to the beat of his heart. It thudded steady, strong, a rhythm that cradled her toward peace. Her fingers traced idle circles on his skin, while Garrett's hand stroked through her hair. "From now on," he whispered, voice rough yet tender, "no more pretending." Aurelia lifted her gaze, eyes shining wet in the moonlight. She answered with a kiss, soft and certain. In that moment she knew. The bold lie spoken that afternoon had begun to take root in truth. And in the small house on the edge of Willow Bend, two souls once shackled by a bargain had at last found freedom in each other's arms. March dawn carried the sweetness of rain across the prairie. Inside the wooden cabin, Aurelia rested her hand against her stomach, overcome by a trembling certainty she had never known. For weeks her body had been changing in quiet ways, morning sickness, sudden dizziness while stacking wood, fatigue that clung to her bones. And that morning, as the first light pushed through the dusty window, she knew. The lie once spoken in defiance before her father-in-law had taken root in truth. She stood still, palm pressed to the flat plane of her belly. Two tides surged within her. Fear that she might fail, that her childhood, of strict orders and sharp words, had left her unfit to be tender, to be a mother. And joy deep, rising joy, a fire kindled not by duty but by love, by the life she and Garrett had chosen together. Garrett returned from the ranch at dusk, shirt damp, face streaked with dust. He pushed through the door, ready to greet her, but froze at the sight of Aurelia standing by the hearth, hands clasped at her middle, eyes shining uncertain yet radiant. "Aurelia? What is it?" She turned to him, her dark eyes shimmering. Taking a breath, she whispered, "Garrett." "I'm truly with child." The world seemed to halt. Garrett blinked, as though the words were too much to grasp. Then light burst in his eyes, bright as summer sky after storm. He laughed a raw, boyish sound, echoing through the walls, and rushed to her, arms tight around her, lifting her clean off the floor. "Good Lord, Aurelia, you've given me the greatest gift in all creation." She laughed through her tears, swatting his shoulder. "Garrett, put me down, I'm dizzy." But he only spun her, laughter booming, scattering the long winter shadows. When at last he set her down, his hands lingered at her waist, his gaze tender in a way she had never seen. "A child. Our child." From that day, the cabin at the edge of Willow Bend seemed lit from within. Where once silence had dwelled, a lively warmth now grew. Garrett, restless with excitement, set to work with hammer and saw, building a cradle of pine. At first the joints were clumsy, the boards rough, but he shaped, sanded, polished, painted it soft gold, every stroke of his hand carrying love. Aurelia, meanwhile, sat on the porch with needle and thread, stitching a small blanket. Her fingers, once bound to ledgers and contracts, now moved gently, pulling each loop of thread as if weaving a piece of the future. Sometimes she pressed the fabric to her cheek, imagining the day her child would be swaddled within it. At night, Garrett sat close beside her by the fire, ear pressed to her belly, as if listening. "What's it saying?" he asked, eyes alight. Aurelia chuckled, smoothing his hair. "Too soon to hear. Never too soon to hear your child," he said, voice full of faith. In his eyes, she no longer saw the idle boy his mother had coddled. She saw a man who had found purpose, their days filled with small, glowing hopes. Carrying sacks of flour and jars of honey, Garrett grinned. Enough to feed a family. Aurelia touched her belly, smiling. Enough to tell stories by the fire. In quiet evenings, they sat on the porch as the sunset bled red across the hills. Garrett's hand covered hers, his voice steady. "I never thought I could amount to much. But now, just thinking of our child, I feel strong enough to do anything." Aurelia leaned to his shoulder. "This child makes me feel truly alive." The prairie wind swept by, rich with grass and wildflowers. Within the cabin, joy grew stronger, pushing away the memories of lonely winters. Not all was free of fear. One day Aurelia wept in the kitchen, haunted by thoughts of her father, Jacob Hayes, the man who had bartered her life like coin. She feared he might return, might claim her child as he once claimed her. Garrett wrapped her close, voice firm. "He can chain your past, but not our child's future. Our child will grow in love, not contracts." She pressed her face to his chest, steadied by the certainty in him. As weeks passed, their hope took shape. Garrett finished the cradle and placed it beside their bed. Aurelia spread her blanket across it, smoothing the folds with tears in her eyes. They stood side by side, silent, until Garrett slipped his arm around her waist. "This house is more than ours now," he whispered. "It's a home." That night by the fire, he laid her hand over her belly, his own warm hand covering hers. "We'll teach our child to ride, to listen to the wind on the plains, to know love above all." Aurelia smiled through tears. "And to know that we once chose each other, against everything." Word traveled through the town. Neighbors saw them at market, hand in hand. Aurelia's belly already rounding. Pitying looks gave way to surprise, then respect. "That colored girl has changed," whispered the seamstress. "And Garrett Boone never seen him work like this," the saloon keeper muttered. Aurelia heard the whispers, but for the first time they did not sting. She gripped Garrett's hand, and he held his head high, proud. One night, wind howled across the prairie. Aurelia sat in their room, hand resting on her belly, smiling at the flutter within. Garrett entered, saw her glowing, and dropped to his knees. Pressing his cheek to her stomach, he whispered, "Hello, little one. It's your father." Aurelia bit her lip, tears blurring her eyes. In that moment she knew. The new fire in their cabin burned bright not only from the stove, but from the hearts within. That night they lay together in silence, complete. Outside, the prairie wind sang its endless hymn, while inside the small wooden house, a family had taken root from a lie once spoken, now turned into the sweetest truth of all. The first summer night settled over Willow Bend, fields dark and wet with the smell of rain. In the cabin at the edge of town, the oil lamp flickered, casting thin light across rough pine walls and the pale face of Aurelia. She lay on the bed, body racked by waves of pain. Each contraction bent her in silence until she bit her lip, fingers whitening against the sheet. Sweat gathered at her brow, curls sticking to her cheeks. Yet in her eyes burned not complaint, but the resolve of a woman ready to meet the fiercest trial of her life. Garrett knelt at her side, clutching her hand in both of his. His face flushed, his blue eyes brimming. Every sound she made struck him like a blade. He pressed his brow to hers, voice ragged, trembling but firm. "I'm here. I'm not leaving. You're strong, Aurelia. You can do this." Old Dr. Peterson, stooped and steady, hovered beside them, giving gruff commands in a voice that rolled like drumbeats in battle. "Almost there, Mrs. Carter. The child's nearly here." The small room filled with sound. Aurelia's gasps, Garrett's whispers, the crackle of firewood, the rush of prairie wind rattling the shingles. Time stretched into aching breaths. A violent contraction tore through her, and Aurelia cried out, crushing Garrett's hand until pain shot through his knuckles. He didn't flinch, only held tighter, as if pouring his strength into her. Tears spilled down his sun-darkened cheeks, all pretense of composure gone. "Don't leave me," he choked. "Please. We both need you." Through the blur of pain, Aurelia caught his gaze. She could not speak, but her eyes steadied him with trust. She drew in one last breath, braced against the storm, and pushed with all that remained. Then the cry came clear, piercing, alive. Garrett's head snapped up, his whole frame shuddering as Dr. Peterson lifted a slick, writhing child into the lamp glow. "A strong boy," the doctor declared. Voice rough, but alight with joy. Garrett reached, arms clumsy but desperate, and gathered the tiny body to his chest. The baby's skin flushed red, fists flailing, wails sharp as arrows. Garrett's tears broke free. He sobbed openly, no longer the man of careless grins, but a boy undone by wonder. "My God. Our son. Our son." He turned, cradling the child, and looked to Aurelia. She lay drained, her face drawn but her eyes shining with something beyond exhaustion. When he laid the baby in her arms, Aurelia's lips curved faintly, a fragile but triumphant smile. "Garrett. You see, he's truly here." Garrett bent, kissed her damp brow, his tears falling into her hair. "You've given me everything." That night, when the child slept sound in the wooden cradle Garrett had carved through the long winter, Aurelia sat upright, an old bundle of papers in her lap, their marriage contract the chains that once made this union a prison. She struck a match, fed flame to the pages. They curled, blackened, drifted into ash carried through the cracks of the cabin. Garrett watched, holding his son in his arms. "Are you certain?" he asked softly. Aurelia nodded, eyes fierce. "We don't need it anymore. From today, no paper decides our life. Only us." He stepped close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. The baby nestled between them, small but weighty with promise. His voice broke, but held steady. "Forever home." She closed her eyes, leaned into him. 3 rhythms merged within her. Garrett's strong heartbeat, the infant's fragile breaths, and her own racing pulse. Days shifted quickly after. Garrett no longer left Aurelia to morning chores. He rose early, split wood, cradled the boy in strong arms until he slept. Aurelia, weary from birth, felt her spirit steady. This was no longer the spoiled son she had once despised. This was a man she could lean on. One morning she stepped onto the porch, child against her chest, and watched Garrett strike wood in the sunlight. The baby flailed his fists, eyes wide, as if reaching toward the rhythm of each swing. Aurelia smiled, whispering, "Look, little one, that's your father, the man who chose us, not by force, but by love." When autumn gilded the prairie, townsfolk began to whisper again. At the market they saw Garrett and Aurelia, hand in hand, their son strapped close against her. Pity had vanished, replaced by curiosity, even respect. "She's not the same woman anymore," murmured the seamstress. "And Boone's boy never seen him work so hard," muttered the saloon keeper. Garrett only tightened his grip on Aurelia's hand. She glanced down at their sleeping child and smiled. The voices of others mattered no more. One early winter night, wind roared across the plains. Their baby cried in the dark. Aurelia stirred, but Garrett was already there, lifting the child, rocking him, humming clumsy lullabies no one had ever heard from his lips. Aurelia lay still, watching by the dim glow, tears burning her eyes. The man who once felt like a stranger now cradled their son with tenderness she had never imagined. When at last he laid the child between them, Garrett clasped her hand. "I'll never leave you alone again." Aurelia leaned against his shoulder, tears falling with her smile. Outside, the prairie wind murmured a hymn of blessing. 3 hearts had found their rhythm together. And in the small cabin at Willow Bend, no one counted days or years any longer. They had, at last, a home that would endure. Night wind swept in from the prairie, heavy with the scent of wild grass. Inside the small cabin at the edge of Willow Bend, firelight flickered across Naomi's face, catching the quiet resolve in her dark eyes. In her hands lay the marriage contract, those brittle pages that once turned her life into a bargain, her heart into a set of chains. She sat still by the stove, fingers trembling yet certain. Caleb entered, their son sleeping against his chest, the boy's warm cheek pressed to his father's shirt. He halted behind her, gaze falling on the yellowed papers. He knew without asking what she meant to do. "Are you sure?" Caleb's voice was low, rough. Naomi nodded. She struck a match, flame bursting bright, before biting into the paper. Fire consumed each line, each binding word, until the pages curled into ash, lifting away into the night wind. Naomi watched the ashes scatter, a faint smile rising at her lips. "We don't need this. No contract will rule our lives. Only us." Caleb drew close, son cradled between them, and wrapped his arm around her. He bent to whisper, "Forever home." Naomi closed her eyes, leaning into his chest. 3 heartbeats merged into one, the strong rhythm of Caleb, the fragile breath of their son, and her own, steady at last. From then, life in the cabin changed in quiet ways. Each morning Caleb rose early, chopping wood or walking the fence line, his axe ringing steady with the cries of their newborn inside. Naomi carried the child to the porch, watching his little hands wave toward his father's labor. She whispered, "Look, son, that is your father, the man who chose us not for duty, but for love." Caleb turned, sweat shining on his brow, and caught their gaze. His smile was whole. He laid down the axe, crossed the yard, kissed his son's forehead, then pressed his lips to Naomi's hair, the smell of fresh grass between them. By autumn, the prairie blazed gold. In town, folks whispered, as the 3 of them walked the market together, Caleb's hand firm around Naomi's, their son nestled against his chest. Pitying stares were gone, replaced by curiosity, respect, even envy. "They've changed," murmured the seamstress. "From a forced marriage to a true family," said another. Caleb only smiled, squeezing Naomi's hand. She lowered her eyes to their son's sleeping face, peace filling her. On a winter night, wind keened across the plains. Their baby stirred, crying. Naomi rose, but Caleb was already there, rocking him, humming a clumsy lullaby he had never sung to anyone before. From her place on the bed, Naomi watched, tears bright. The man who once seemed spoiled and distant now stood tender and steady. A father, a husband, a home. Laying the child back, Caleb reached for Naomi's hand. "I'll never leave you alone again." She rested her head to his shoulder, tears warm with her smile. Outside, the prairie wind carried a hymn of blessing for the 3 of them. Spring returned, grass rolling green over the hills. Caleb built a new chair for the porch, wide enough for all 3 to sit and watch the sunsets. Naomi sewed small clothes while he carved toys of wood, their son swinging his arms in rhythm to their laughter. One evening, Naomi lifted from a chest a lace kerchief, the only keepsake from her father's house. Folding it carefully, she laid it beside a tiny shirt she had sewn. To her, It marked the long road she had traveled. From the girl bound by her father's iron will to a woman free, mistress of her own life. "You've gone further than anyone thought," Caleb said, hand closing over hers. Naomi smiled. "We have." Word of them spread through Willow Bend. From gossip of a cold wedding to talk of admiration, their story shifted. When asked their secret, Caleb only said, "Choosing each other, day after day." Naomi needed no words. She held her son close, knowing happiness is not declared but lived. One evening, with the prairie washed red by dusk, Caleb carried their son outside. The boy babbled, wide eyes fixed on his father. Caleb laughed, heart swelling, then looked back at Naomi standing in the doorway, hair loose, face aglow in the sunset. He stepped in, wrapped her from behind, whispering, "Thank you for staying." Her eyes shimmered. "And thank you for becoming who you are." Their kiss was certain now, no longer shy, but the seal of two souls who had endured distance, sorrow, false vows, and found at last the only truth that mattered. They belonged. That night, lamplight glowed warm on cabin walls. Caleb laid their son in the cradle and sat by the window. Naomi joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. Together they listened. The prairie wind, the baby's soft breaths, their own silence. "Do you think," Caleb asked, "we had to travel so far, only to find this home?" Naomi nodded. "Without the long road, we wouldn't know its worth." Outside, the prairie sang without end. Inside the cabin, three hearts beat in harmony. No more chains, no more contracts, no empty vows, only their forever home. And perhaps, dear listeners, who have walked through many seasons, you see yourselves in this tale. A beginning less than perfect, a road hard to bear, and the quiet joy of finding your true companion. If this story stirred a memory in you, we welcome your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and continue walking with us through more Wild West love stories.